I'm going to do a quick little story. So we were talking about CFOs. So at one point in time, I was at American Eagle Outfitters, and we were doing the rationale for loyalty. So you had anything from a 9-year-old buying at American Eagle, and you had mom buying for her 3 boys. So the question was, how can we identify the 13-year-old that we could communicate based upon COPPA guidelines and permission-based marketing, all the way up to dialoguing with mom. And the program was 100% off of the GE Consumer Finance, now Synchrony credit card, and it was the proprietary card. So that's how they got some coupons based upon their spend. It was purely transactional, nothing having to do with advocacy, influencers. Their digital capability was very immature, and this goes back to 2004, okay? So how did I get there, and how did I get the sign-off? Mike Mathias. Mike Mathias was third in command in finance, and the two of us went to Jim O'Donnell side by side. We worked on that business case, and the only way we sold in loyalty at American Eagle was with my business partner in finance. It wasn't procurement. It was all about finance, working with the brand and the marketing team. So everything that we just talked about in terms of how important finance is as a partner is just key and essential, and I lived it. And the program is still thriving there at American Eagle, still to this day. So from that,
good intro.
It's a good intro. I think it's all relevant, right? So what's the process and methodology of creating that alignment with finance? So when you get a call, it's typically finance that's saying, you know, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. I've got this liability on my books.
Yeah.
I don't know what the heck to put down, how much I should allocate for, you know, dealing with SOX requirements and so on. So just tell a little story from that perspective.
Yeah, it's probably good to just level set on what a loyalty program liability is. Does anybody in the room actually have to touch the liability and deal with that at their companies? Yeah, one person. That's good. Oh yeah, all right, a couple people. So, so what the liability is, it's just you got to put a liability on your balance sheet to represent all the points that you issued that are still outstanding that will eventually get redeemed in the future, right? You have to do this. The accounting regulations require that you do this, and it's often an enormous number, right? For, you know, the airlines, it's in the billions, but, you know, we got a lot of retailers here. Even as a retailer, this can come to be a very, very large quantity, potentially one of the largest items on your balance sheet, right? And it could be, you know, so a lot, for the loyalty marketers, do you really need to know what the liability is? Like, should you care? The answer is sort of like yes and no. No, in the sense that, like, there's a lot of, like, accounting nuance. It's sort of just keeping track of IOUs, right? And, like, in that sense, a loyalty marketer does not really need to care about it. But embedded in the liability calculation is an understanding of the cost of all the points that you've issued, right? So you're issuing a point today. How much is it actually going to cost you, right? And that is absolutely something that every single loyalty marketer should care very deeply about, because it's going to be the single largest expense in your loyalty program business model, right? If you sort of isolate the loyalty program as a standalone business unit, which isn't always the case, it's not explicitly a standalone business unit, but you can sort of do a mental exercise of isolating it. You know, you'll have some software, you'll have the infrastructure, you'll have a couple people. The single largest expense, redemption costs, right? And there's no business school in the world that teaches you, Wharton does not teach you to to ignore your expenses, right? They do not teach that, right? So especially your single largest expense, you got to pay attention to it, right? And so that is problematic. But this is what we see. Despite it being the single largest expense in the loyalty program business model, very few loyalty programs invest any energy in really trying to understand what that expense is and predict it with any degree of accuracy. Why? Because it is literally the most boring part of a loyalty program, right? Like, it's not where you want to spend your time.
You don't appear to be a boring guy.
Well, yeah. So, you know, I find a lot of joy. I find it a lot of fun to analyze these sorts of things. But that's sort of our reality, right? And so for a lot of CFOs, they're going to look at this thing and say, well, geez, like, how are we, you know, this presents a big financial risk to our balance sheet. If there's any volatility in this, it could completely crush our quarter, right? And they, as I mentioned earlier, are a very important stakeholder in the organization. So we should, as loyalty marketers, care about it in the sense of it's very directly tied to the cost of the redemptions, right, and the expense. But more broadly as well, the CFO is a key stakeholder. We got to get them comfortable. We got to make sure that they know that we're handling it correctly. We're managing that risk so that, they can become an advocate as opposed to often, which is the case, a skeptic.
Yeah. So going all the way back to 1997 with my buddy Rick Ferguson and Bill Hannafin in frequency marketing days that then became Epsilon, clients would say breakage is good. Yeah. I don't want people to even know that they even have a reward to ultimately buy down a transaction, right?
Yeah. It's nonsense.
Nonsense. And the thing of it is that, if you figure out what your expiration rules are and how you want to go and incentivize a redemption, and then ultimately you see that there's an incremental lift when you have a redemption, which then grabs that hidden 15% of that audience that should look like the best of the best customer from a Pareto rule standpoint. So talk to me about that kind of a dialogue, and then I have a follow-on after that.
Yeah, so it's a great point, and a lot of people think that, right? And I think it's short-term thinking. I think it's sort of, in the grand scheme of things, largely nonsense. Now, obviously, there's some level of balance here. You can't just give away everything. There's a limit to that. But
well, let alone you got markdown dollars too, which theoretically goes on the loyalty sheet as well.
Yep. But the sort of secret here is that you can't just look at cost in isolation. No good business decision has ever been made by just looking at cost, right? And yet that's what we do whenever we look at the liability is that's all we're talking about here is cost. And by the way, we're doing that every single quarter. We're putting that in front of the CEO, the CFO, the auditors, other key important people in the organization. Hey, we've got this gigantic cost here. And that's all we're doing. If you're doing that every single quarter and all you're showing them is the cost, of course they're going to be in that sort of cost minimization mindset. They're going to be cost focused. They're going to look at the loyalty program as a cost center as opposed to a value generator, right? So therein lies problem number one, right? Is that's all we're talking about. We need to talk about the cost benefit trade-off, right? And how do we do that? Well, it comes back to what Pete was talking about. Customer lifetime value gives us the complete picture, right? It's the net economic picture of what's going on, not just the cost, right? So that has to be a critical part of the dialogue if we're going to sort of move the discussion from the idea of, hey, let's have breakage. Let's get people not to use their points, because what happens then is they become disengaged. Customer lifetime value deteriorates. Enterprise value deteriorates.
They're not believers in the program if they're not redeeming.
Exactly, right? And you can clearly see there's a strong correlation between your highest redeeming people are also your highest value people. So yes, they will cost you the most in redemptions, but what they're going to give back to you vastly outweighs the cost in redemptions, right? And that's the picture we need to get to, but not a lot of people are. How many people are actually doing a report out on customer lifetime value in the C-suite every quarter? None. How many people are doing a report out on the cost of the points every single quarter? Everybody, right?
How many people are building attrition models to identify the leaky bucket? Because you're going to lose some of that 20% just because of uncontrollable churn.
Yeah. And that's totally fine.
They're coming to Margaritaville, but now they moved and they're not going to Margaritaville anymore, even though they loved their experience in Margaritaville for anniversaries and birthdays and everything else. Yeah. So thinking of loyalty as a cost center has to start either when you're originating a program or when you're refreshing a program. So if the perspective at the beginning and the C-suite really hasn't changed, and they constantly are looking at the cost of the program and not thinking about the valuation of the program, please, when you refresh the program, get a different chemistry, a different mindset in the mind of the C-suite when you're refreshing, I think is really important.
Yeah.
And then also building the right methodologies for projecting on the metrics.
Yeah.
And also having the right accounting methodology for liability, because if they're putting in 100% every single year,
you're shooting yourself in the foot. You're being it's not good to be too conservative.
It's very conservative.
Yeah, I'd much rather be on the conservative side than undershooting it. we've been in, I've been doing this for so long. We've seen so many loyalty programs. Loyalty programs generally are not very good at this because they're not investing the time and energy into the actuarial science needed to actually quantify the liability correctly.
Yeah, but don't say loyalty programs. We have one experience. It's not the loyalty person that wasn't very good at it, right? It was the finance people.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah.
They didn't have the best practices in place, and you taught them.
It's not fair for finance.
That was a paid endorsement. No, it was a non-paid.
It's not fair to put that ask a finance person to do an actuarial exercise. They're not trained in that. It's like, yes. So my mom had a brain tumor when we were kids, right? We didn't go to our family physician and say, hey, grab a drill and a scalpel. We found the best brain surgeon in the city and asked him, right? Even though they're both doctors, the family physician and the brain surgeon, domain expertise there was very, very relevant, right? A finance person and an actuary, I'm sure to a lot of you in the room, like the nuanced difference between the two are sort of like, well, maybe non-existent. There is a big difference there, and the domain expertise is really relevant. Liability management, being able to actually quantify how many points that you have outstanding today are going to get redeemed over a really long horizon. I mean, we've done analyses where points live for like 30 years, and then they get redeemed, right? That's what actuaries specialize in, is that science of being able to do that long-term projection and be able to manage the risk associated with that and communicate to those risks to auditors and to CFOs and that sort of thing, right? And I think one of the things that actuaries can do as credentialed actuaries is we can provide an actuarial opinion. It's sort of a certification, if you will. I can hand that to a CFO. I can hand that to an auditor. And that makes the whole process of the review of the liability just much, much smoother, right? And so that's a big component of what we provide to our clients.
So before I started my firm 5 years ago with Jay Weinberg, I was at Deloitte. And they have auditors at Deloitte.
They have auditors, that's
and they all do handstands when they hear that Kairos has been involved because they don't have to rely on anything other than just looking at your work and go, well, that's a big relief. We don't have to fake it. No, they're smart enough, but they rely on you as well. So the one thing that Phil said, and Mary said it as well, is from a customer experience standpoint and advocacy, I am super passionate about the associate as the key to the program and promoting the program and having technology there in place to remind the customer that they actually have a reward in their profile. Yeah. So the whole aspect of real-time recognition and reward and promoting it, and then seeing the incremental lift that occurs when they're spending free cash, even if they're getting 40% off and it's allowed, to still use a reward when they're using a 40% off or a 30% off coupon is so key and essential. Have you seen, or do you provide strategic recommendations to clients besides applying your actuarial science capability and your modeling capability to telling them the best practices or the right benchmarks for encouraging redemption?
Yeah, so I leave the strategy to you, David, right? That's why
well, you call me
right?
up, but I thought I'd ask the question anyway.
I'm not a strategy guy. I'm a tactics guy, right? So I get the data, and I look at all the customers. I put values on the customers. I build models to predict what they're going to do, and I de-average, right? I don't just look at what things look like in aggregate. I de-average so that we understand each individual customer and the differences. And that's where the tactics can really come into play, right? Is say, hey, we should do something to these guys that's different to these guys over there.
We're looking at that cohort analysis as well to see the redeemers versus the non-redeemers and those with high value versus low value and so on.
Yeah, and that's the idea, right? And then what you can clearly see is when you start just sort of thinking about customers as so like, again, I'm much more of like the scientific person, so this is gonna sound so cold, but like basically like as probabilities, right? What are they gonna do next? What are those things? You can sort of understand, what are the right things, triangulate on the right things we should be doing for different segments of people, right? And it's a nice way to really sort of put numbers on it so that which can really help you make some decisions. Customer lifetime value models, attrition models, all these things are helpful for that. But at the end of the day, all it helps you do is sort of triangulate in the right direction of what you might want to do. Ultimately, what you need to do is like some sort of test and learn.
Yes.
right? Where like to understand precisely what is the right thing we should be doing for this segment over here versus this segment, you got to run some experiments. You got to see what happens. You got to apply the sort of robust statistical analysis on those experiments to sort of know with statistical significance, is it moving the needle? Am I improving customer lifetime value, right? And I think if you could do that sort of thing at scale, then you can build this almost like a systematic engine here that can really drive loyalty, drive repeat, drive improve customer lifetime value, and ultimately more profits and improved enterprise value.
Yeah, that's so true, as Rick was saying, and describing the Renaissance and thinking about risk and reward, and the comments that Phil shared in terms of innovation and so on. The whole aspect of test and learn is essential.
Yeah.
And you've even seen companies like Dunkin' Donuts redo their program, and everybody went ballistic over it. But they felt pressured, I'm sure, by the franchisees because they didn't want to give away free food.
Yeah.
Gee, what a surprise in the food industry.
Right.
You make a heck of a lot more margin on a cup of coffee, let me tell you,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
That's the reason why you get your 7th cup when you go to Speedway after buying 6. So as it relates to where the growth actually comes from, are you starting to see, there's a question that Peter said relative to where do you see the biggest amount of change? Have you gotten any feelers from companies in the B2B space now that are starting to get into loyalty, whether it's in the healthcare area, the insurance area, banking, et cetera, where they're starting to think, when it comes to healthcare, healthier outcomes. Are they starting to rise up and you're getting inquiries from them? Because where the base of your company was hotel and airline, I believe.
Yep.
But where are you getting the majority
We're
of
still vast majority B2C. Some conversations I've had around B2B. But that's definitely not. I think that there's a lot of opportunity there for sure, right? But
because the shift is in millions and billions,
yeah,
right? Because there's some industries, you got John Deere and you got Caterpillar and you got Kubota, right?
Yep.
So we've worked in that space with one of those 3 companies, and you're talking about billions of dollars in shift in market share. Yeah. As far as the equipment is concerned, I'm talking about buying a pair of jeans here, right?
Yeah.
So do you see that as an emerging
I think
area?
there's definitely an area to apply a lot of these spaces. What a loyalty program looks like in that space, I guess I haven't spent too much time thinking about it, but if we sort of just abstract it away and just say, hey, how can the analytics that we learned and sort of honed in the loyalty world and the B2C world, how can that apply in the B2B world? Absolutely. This idea of, customer lifetime value, retention, attrition, all of these models, and leveraging the data to be smarter about it and de-averaging instead of looking at the total, but understanding there's not all customers are created equal and treating different customers in different ways. That'll make us way better, right? I think, regardless of B2C, B2B, whatever industry you're talking about, I think those are sort of universal.
Right. So in the spirit of Summit, and one of the call-outs from the last session, Peter, you were great in both, so thank you, is benchmarks. So there are benchmarks by industry for NPS and CSAT, right? But in terms of benchmarks of key metrics, I think one takeaway from here that we can definitely collectively from this event come back to everybody that's attended here and share benchmarks. They're not typically shared. I love the idea of putting some of those benchmarks and areas of success into annual reports, and even talking to analysts. So again, at American Eagle, they were firing questions at our CFO, our CEO, nonstop about the All Access Pass program. How many of you signed up this quarter? What's the average transaction, a member versus non-member? What's the incremental lift when they redeem a reward? Aren't you concerned about markdowns? Are you reducing your ultimate markdown budget? So I was on those calls and then in real time feeding back to them without Slack, by the way, those answers to those questions, even though I had prepared them for most of them. So, having a partner like Goldman Sachs, they're at your side to help you with some of that dialogue. But I love the call out about providing benchmarks, and we can definitely follow up with that as well. Rick?